How's it going, everybody? Greg here, Greg Arias Media here with another episode of Discog Devil, where I go over the worst and best of an artist's discography. And this week, I'm going over one of my favorite bands of all time, Rustic Overtones. Originating out of Portland, Maine in the early 90s, they started off as a band known as Aces Wild, and only as a three-piece, over time gaining new members, and eventually becoming Rustic Overtones. They released an album in 1994 called Shish Boom Bam, which is the only one I have never heard. I'm assuming it's one of those very rare albums that has very rare print. And based on the current lineup and the current set lists that I've heard live, or the most recent set lists I've heard live, this album is not relevant to the current Rustic canon, so it's the only album I am not going to be reviewing on this list because I cannot find it for the life of me, no matter where I go. The only place that I can attempt to find it is a physical copy on Amazon for like $100. I'm on a budget. The first era of Rustic Overtones, I would say from 1995 to 2007, has much more of a fusion of rock, soul, ska, funk, and depending on which album you're on, maybe a little bit of metal. And jazz, I shouldn't forget jazz. Jazz is pretty important on a lot of these early albums. I would say that this is a band that should have gotten big during the big ska explosion of the mid to late 90s, and even early 2000s ska still had some level of relevancy on radio and MTV. And Rustic definitely had a very unique sound within this sort of movement. Unfortunately, they just did not have the luck with getting the promotion that I believe that they should have had. In 2009, they would release an album called New Way Out, which showed a dramatic sonic shift in tone. This focused much more on a sort of 60s rock feel, with some of the garage rock and psychedelic rock from that time period, as well as focusing a bit more on the soul and even a little bit of pop elements and some indie elements as well. I got into Rustic Overtones around Light at the End era from seeing a music video on YouTube, Letter to the President, and then I listened to Rock Like War, and from there I just fell in love with them, and ever since then I've listened to every single album outside of their first album, Shish Boom Bam, which again is not going to be on this list because I can't find the fucking thing. This is a band that I feel definitely deserved much more attention, considering that they were a band that just had the right sound and at the right time. And maybe it's because of geographics, because they're from Maine, and maybe because they just didn't get signed in time, and of course with the whole Arista thing, which I'll go over once I get to Viva Nueva on this list. But that doesn't mean that they're not succeeding on their own terms, on their own independent level. A lot of the band members, whether current or former, have gone on to do many different musical projects. Dave and John Roods are part of a band called Armies, as well as, I think John Roods was also in Paranoid Social Club, which was also fronted by Dave Gutter. And both of them have just been involved in many different projects. And Dave Gutter actually recently, this year, started Red Mustard Entertainment, not only as a label for Maine artists to jump on, but also a YouTube channel that if people submit videos to, they might actually have sort of a boost in promotion, and which I think is a very stellar idea. So with that being said, where do the Rustic Overtones albums sort of lay from worst to best? I'm sort of a Rustic Overtones stan, so bear with me if I end up being a little bit maybe overly positive on some of these albums. This is Discog Devil, Rustic Overtones. Let's go! At the bottom of this list at number 7 we have Let's Start a Cult Part 1. This was definitely a sonic transition album where they focused more on the garage rock and psychedelic rock of the 60s while fusing it with some funk and a little bit of soul in the mix, depending on the song. This album to me was cool, and I see where they were going sonically, but I think this transition wasn't as smooth. This is also their first concept album, where, if I remember correctly from an interview that Dave had, he explained that the album was sort of like this band talking with fans sort of thing, and them being this cult who would end up spreading love and sort of breaking down the system of hate. And while I admit to not have followed the concept very closely. I think each song on their own individual merit works fine, but sonically the mix I think isn't as strong. This is where they started to experiment a little bit with some lo-fi recording, and I don't think it really registers. Some songs just lack punch, whether it's due to the mix or just the songwriting in general. Again, this was a transitional album, so I could see a little bit of fault in the songwriting. The album opens up, I think, pretty strong with Let's Start a Cult 1. It actually opens up with these loud yeah, yeahs, and then this very catchy little flute. It has this very indie rock kind of pop sort of appeal to it that I think works out pretty well. It's definitely one of the more unique songs in the Rustic Overtones catalog. It leads into part 2, which is much more of a fuzzy, psychedelic banger of a track that I think works pretty well in the context, and I think is a good transition from part 1. So definitely both of them side to side are very nice. I Like It Low, I think, is the best song on this album. It has this very syrupy slow tempo. The saxes and horns on this are just very slow and very earwormy. It's a very psychedelic moment without having too much in terms of psychedelic effects outside of some like reverb and shimmer on the guitar chords. But it's so slow, it's kind of hypnotic in a way. We'll Get Right In follows that track, and I think is a pretty decent indie rock song. It definitely is pretty catchy, but it's not the most unique moment, and I think that's the problem with a lot of this album. This album didn't quite stand out as a Rustic Overtones album, because again, with it being sort of a different sound that they were approaching, I feel like they had a bit of an identity crisis on some of these songs. Outside of the tracks I mentioned, there's not really a lot that's memorable about this album. I wouldn't put, I think, any of these songs outside of maybe I Like It Low in like a top 20 songs list, maybe even top 30. The closing track, Let's Go Out With a Bang, does not sound nearly as big as I feel that it should. Say Yes is really slow, kind of syrupy, kind of a love romantic kind of song, and it just doesn't quite hit. The other thing about this album that I didn't quite like is the energy level of this album. It's not the Rustic Overtones energy that I think a lot of people have come to know and love. And understandably, this is sort of the second wave, or sort of the second era, second wind of Rustic Overtones coming off of New Way Out. I just wish that the songwriting in general was just more energetic, and he definitely has really cool rhythms that he's worked through. So I would like to see where he goes with even faster tempo stuff, which actually part 2 of this series I think showcases a bit better. Transition. Coming in at number 6, we have Let's Start a Cult Part 2. And this, I feel, is what the first album should have been, at least in terms of production. I think the production on here is a lot crisper, it's a lot more clean. It definitely doesn't have any of the lo-fi stuff that was riddled through Part 1. And the songwriting on here is much more diverse, it's much more ambitious, I think, in scope, which is why I would definitely recommend this album over Part 1. This album, I feel, is where Rustic Overtones is in a really good spot, especially with this transition into a newer territory. Even though it's not as energetic and as rock-oriented as I would like it to be, I can see this sort of era of Rustic Overtones working well with this sort of sound. The album starts off really strong with The Show Must Go On, having this really funky groove. Gary on the drums is just fantastic here. The horn line is super nice, the bass line is really good, and despite the fact the guitar is not really used on this song very much, they have like this really cool sort of muted strumming parts that sort of are thrown throughout the verses that are just really, really nice. It then goes into a very sort of tropical, like an islandy sort of sound with Martyrs. It's definitely a different approach to songwriting that I haven't heard Rustic ever do before. And while I think this was the first single from this album that I heard, and while I initially didn't enjoy it at first, I feel like in the context of this album, and as years have gone by, I've grown to really enjoy sort of the different melodic approaches that this song itself does. Every single instrument has its own like significant part to this song. Bonfire, Undefeatable is absolutely catchy. Us Versus Other People, the fourth track off this album, is definitely one of my favorites of any Rustic Overtones song. It just has this really cool synth line. The horns have their great parts that are used very sparingly, and it's, I don't know how to describe this track. It's definitely not something I've heard Rustic ever do before, and it's pulled off so nicely. It's very soulful, very melodic, and it's just one of the most beautiful songs I think they've made. The second half gets much more into the psychedelic and soul territory, which I think is kind of hit and miss. I do enjoy a lot of these songs. In fact, I do enjoy this album as a whole, but the second half doesn't quite hit as much for me. They actually have a drug song called High on Everything, where lyrically you can take a fucking guess what the song's about. It's definitely a very interesting instrumental. At the very least, it's definitely one of the better modern psychedelic soul songs I've heard. Even if lyrically I think it's a little bit drawn out, because like, make this drug reference, make this drug reference, drugs, 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 drugs. The last three songs definitely go into the more soulful territory, and I think the strongest one of the three is track 7, You Should Be Worshipped. I've seen them play this song, I think, every show since they've released this album that I've been to, and it is just great. The vocals on here are very, very almost gospel-like, and the song is just super catchy. This is definitely the sound that I think Rustic can work with, sort of as like a bass, sort of like a baseline of where they are now and sort of the standard in which they should have. This is definitely the better of the two cult albums. And I know that Rustic are working on a new album, in which maybe I should have waited to do this list until after they finish the album. Highly recommend this for any new Rustic listener, even though I would recommend the older stuff first. If you want to get into the newest one, I could highly recommend this album. At number 5 on this list, we have Light at the End, which was released in 2007. As far as I'm aware, this is still the fastest selling album, at least the fastest selling local album in Maine music history. And I would say for good reason. The singles off this album were extremely strong, with Rock Like War and Letter to the President, I think both being extremely strong songs. Letter to the President actually being a bit of a different sonic shift, being much more acoustic and having sort of xylophone notes. It's definitely a very minimalist song. Rock Like War, which opens up the first full song off this album after the Calm intro, just rips. This song is one of the best Rustic Overtones singles, if not songs, period. This is definitely a way to start off sort of a comeback album. But the reason why I have this at number 5, and this sort of became more apparent after they re-released Viva Nueva, I think back in 2014 or 2015, when they re-released the album and had the Arista version masters finally under their possession, so then they could release a remastered version of the Tommy Boy record, and then had the Arista record as disc 2. A lot of songs on here are just re-recorded B-sides from those sessions. Not that it's necessarily a bad thing, but this album then sort of feels more like a compilation than a full album. Hardest way possible, they have a third version on here, which is personally my favorite version, but at the same time, not too many bands I listen to re-record a song 3 times. So a strike against originality on that one, even though this is my favorite version. They have a re-recorded version of Car Sick, which I do enjoy this version over what was on the Arista version. I'll make a whole video on the Arista version versus Tommy Boy version of Viva Nueva, but that's not the album I'm talking about here. But I guess I kind of have to talk about it because some songs are from there. But Car Sick as a song I think is good. It's not one of the stronger Rustic Overtones songs, but you know, it's fun. It's a decent song. Then there's Carnival, which is one of the weaker Rustic Overtones songs in their catalog. It's not really super memorable. It has a very kind of carnival-esque sound to it, riding on a Ferris wheel kind of music. It's kind of boring. Because then they have the song Happy at the end, which I think is a great closing track for this album. It's a very light, smooth, funk kind of song. It's almost jazzy, but it's just more like a mellow sort of funk song. It's pretty nice. The version I ended up getting, because they actually had a version with a song called Brown Leather Bag, which, to be perfectly honest, is okay. It wasn't like a stellar track, but it was okay. The version that I got was the re-released version of this album. I don't remember for what record label this was reissued, but they ended up having Valentine's Day Massacre on here, which is the exact same version of the song that was on Viva Nueva, on both versions of Tommy Boy or Arista. So I found that to be kind of weird. The other original tracks on here are pretty solid. Troublesome I thought was okay. Not a super strong Rustic song. It's kind of a nice, funky pop song. Then you have Oxygen, which is one of the most energetic songs that Rustic has ever recorded, and I fucking love it. Also on this album, you sort of have some string effects to it. Now, whether those strings are actually recorded through live instrumentation or these are synth strings, I'll admit I haven't paid as close attention. Some songs sound like real symphonic instruments, some sound like it's through synth. I apologize for not putting that down in my notes. This album is good, and I think has a lot of great songs, such as Rock Like War, Oxygen, and the title track, but I feel like some of these songs kind of felt like standard Rustic Overtones songs, and the fact that afterward, sort of relearning the fact that some of these songs were actually from Viva Nueva sort of era songs. I mean, they're good, but they're not the greatest from those sessions. At number 4, in the middle of this list, we have New Way Out, released in 2009. Rustic Overtones basically hired an orchestra to work with the songwriting process of this album. This was definitely the most experimental album of Rustic's work to date, and I would actually argue this is still their most experimental record, because this one is definitely a standout for just being completely different from any Rustic Overtones albums. You could argue that New Way Out was sort of the shift in tone from Light at the End, but I feel like a complete transition album was the Let's Start a Cult Part 1 and 2, where this one still truly stands out on its own for not sounding like any of the other albums. So Rustic Overtones completely produced this themselves. They took about 2 years to record this, and they had an orchestra. So this was definitely going to be different, and it shows. And I think for the better. Opening up with the title track, it has this very huge horn swell, and it's pretty slow, mellow verses. It's very catchy. It's very earwormy. It's not really rock, but it's definitely different. I don't really know how to describe it. I wouldn't say it's nothing on this album is as hard as anything off the albums prior to this. The energy is just different on this album. It picks up in speed on the song Everybody Needs to Be Somebody's Friend, and it definitely sounds like a sort of a garage rock sort of tune out of the 60s with a slightly modern and kind of quirkier approach to the songwriting. There's 2 really long songs on this album, Nuts and Bolts being almost 8 minutes, and it's like a 5-part song that goes through different instrumental passages. And then there's Like the Blues, which is a really long, syrupy, very depressing, but also very gorgeous sounding song. In between those 2 really long songs is arguably one of my favorite tracks off the album. Not arguably, it's my fucking list. This is one of my favorite tracks altogether, which I think if there were any justice in the radio music world, altogether I think it could have been a pretty decent sized hit. It has this really cool soul and gospel sort of approach to the vocals. The guest vocals on here are really nicely approached in the second verse, and it just has this really cool dynamic swelling. The second half of the record gets into some kind of weirder territory. It definitely goes in sort of the quirkier, definitely Beatles-esque territory, like with Kathleen Caffeine. I Just Can't Shake You would easily fall under this category as well. The song Common Cold is easily one of the catchiest and I think one of the best songs off this album. It's driven by this really cool piano riff and has some really tasty horn lines littered throughout the song. And it's just, like I said, it's just really fucking catchy. The common cold, I cannot say. The smallest spark that beats the sun is this very bombastic ending, and it's definitely the most upbeat in terms of tempo. It ends on this like super dynamic explosion of all the instruments just sort of swelling and swelling, and then it just ends on this really huge, long last note. So while this isn't the most energetic Rustic Overtones album, and you could probably argue in that regard that it's a transition album to what would lead to Let's Start a Cult 1 and 2, I'd say this album really is probably one of the best albums of the Zero Zeros. I could argue that for any of the Rustic Overtones albums I'm about to go over, but this one truly is just, no one was making this kind of album in 2009. I can't think of any other album within that decade, or even this decade for that matter, that sounds like this. Even when sort of the Beatles mania was happening and indie rock kind of had its Beatles and sort of 60s revisionist revival phase, this is just a really different album, and it's definitely an experience, if nothing else. For the bronze at number 3, we have Rooms by the Hour, released in 1998. Focusing more on the funk and soul portions of their formula, this album is definitely cleaner in production, it's a bit smoother in the songwriting. There's definitely still some very hard moments. Rooms by the Hour is actually a pretty diverse album, especially following up Long Division, which was already a pretty diverse album as that was. It showed some varying genre hops in songwriting. There's a couple of short songs that follow like almost a rootsier, almost country sound. There's one that's just a straight up almost punk song called The Heist. The shorter songs on this album I feel actually sort of tier the overall experience of the album. They're not bad songs, I just don't feel like they're necessary. If I had to give one gripe to this album and why it's at number 3, it's primarily for that reason. Because otherwise, there are some really strong songs on here. The other reason why it's at number 3 is because the opener, while I enjoy, is not as strong of an opener, I think, as other Rustic Overtones albums. Even Let's Start a Cult 1 and 2, I think, are stronger openers and sort of representations of an album than Feast or Famine. And I like Feast or Famine, but the song as an opener is very misleading, especially when it's followed up by Girl Germs, which is a very funky, dark, and catchy fucking song, where Feast and Famine is, while it's very nice, it's super smooth, it's very soulful, it's very mellow. As the start of an album, especially coming off Long Division, it's completely contrasting from what Long Division opened up with. It's not a bad song, I just feel like as an opener it was a bad choice. And sonically, this album is a bit inconsistent at times. Also note on this album that they have their first versions of both the songs Check and Hardest Way Possible, in which I think Viva Nueva did better with those versions. The ones on here are cool, but they're not great. They don't really stand out as to what they would become on the follow-up album. Don't get it twisted though, this album has classic Rustic Overtones songs on here. You have such catchy songs on here that, you know, if this album was the one that got a lot of attention, I could see why. You have extremely catchy songs on here. Feast and Famine, I think, is a good song. It would be a very good single. You also have Girl Germs, which is catchy as hell. You have Kickin' and Screamin', Pink Belly, which, even though it has more of a jazz feel to it, it's still extremely catchy, and the way that it's approached with its more alternative rock third leg is really, amazing. And you also have Sugarcoat, which is just starts off just like this incredibly menacing horn line, and then it just goes into this cheery, happy chorus telling you, I think you're ugly and you're fucked. I love it. The first half of History Crush comes off with this really cool, arena-sized horn line. This then the second half of the song, after just all the instruments sort of explode in this really noisy, sort of cacophonous, moment, once the instruments pick back up, it's in this really smooth, jazzy sort of build-up that then leads into this really soulful sax solo that goes on for well over a minute, and it's fucking brilliant. Of course, at the end of the album, you have the classic Rustic Overtones song, Iron Boots. This song would have easily been huge on the charts if this had been, promoted on a major label. This album was not. But if it were, this song would have easily been fucking huge everywhere. Iron Boots, the classic Rustic Overtones song, because it shows their unique fusion of alternative rock, funk rock, soul, ska, just all in one. No other band sounded like this. God damn it. Why wasn't this huge? I mean, it was huge for the state of Maine, but this album, I feel, should have been even bigger. I mean, I'm going to say that for the next two albums that I have on this list also, but it's like, fuck! It's amazing! For the silver at number 2, we have Viva Nueva, which was released in 2001. Note that the version I'm going over on this video is the Tommy Boy version, because that was the one that was originally released. I will have a separate video talking about the Arista version, sort of going over which one I felt was better, strengths and weaknesses, and if the Arista was released, on an A&R perspective, what singles would have been released, do I think overall would have done better than the Tommy Boy version, etc., blah, 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 blah. But I'm going to be focusing on this album, the Tommy Boy version, for this list. And for reasons because this should have been huge. Long story short, Rustic Overtones were signed to Arista in 1999. They recorded an album that was a bit harder than what Arista was originally thinking. Part of this reason was because the management that originally brought Rustic Overtones in ended up being shifted elsewhere, so this was a completely different management of Arista Records that ended up listening to this album, and they said, we want you to be Dave Matthews Band, and Rustic Overtones were just like, where the fuck did you get that idea? So they left Arista, got onto Tommy Boy, re-recorded some songs, and recorded some new songs, scrapping some other songs. I think this album, if it had better funding and was promoted better, and I understand that Tommy Boy was more of an indie label that just happened to have a distribution deal with Warner Brothers, but I feel like if this album was promoted better, this would have been huge. This album had a lot of big names associated with it. You had Tony Visconti, and I'm hoping I pronounced his name right here, Tony Visconti. I'm really hoping I'm pronouncing your name right, and if you happen to be watching this, I'm sorry. You had Tony Visconti on the production end, and he's the go-to guy for David Bowie for at least a vast majority of his discography. And which, fun fact, David Bowie is featured on 2 songs on this album. And according to Dave, David Bowie never charged for those features. He really enjoyed Rustic Overtones. David Bowie was a great man. David Bowie was featured on the chorus for Sector Z and had background vocals on the song Man Without a Mouth. You also had features from Funkmaster Flex on the song Smoke, and Imogen Heap, I think is her name, on Valentine's Day Massacre. This album should have been big. It really should have been big. You have super catchy songs like Come On and Combustible, two songs that were actually released as singles and were recorded in the Tommy Boy version of this record. And I am just so frustrated that they did not get bigger than Circumstances suck. Super funky, catchy rock that, Come On has much more of a kind of popular approach. It's not as hard as Combustible was, but Combustible, both of them just have these hyper catchy choruses and compositions that just are just fucking earworms. No song on here, I think there's only a couple songs that go beyond 4 minutes. This was definitely a much more condensed and commercial effort, and they did it with flying colors all throughout this album. If there were only a couple of tracks I'd give a little bit of shit to on Tommy Boy version, and they were on Arista as well, but there were a couple moments on here that just didn't quite fit. I felt that the song Baby Blue, being much more of a lounge jazz kind of song, just did not fit the feel of this album at all. It comes right after Smoke, which makes no goddamn sense whatsoever. I guess maybe as like a come down from what like a psychedelic funk rock explosion that Smoke was, but it just feels so out of place on this album. It doesn't have a single lick of rock anywhere on the song. So Baby Blue was easily the weakest track, and I feel like is a throwaway. Outside of that song, every song on here is just fucking fantastic. You have the second versions of Check and Hardest Way Possible, which this version of Check just should have been a single and should have been huge for either version of the album. And the version of Hardest Way Possible, while I did like the re-recorded version of Light at the End just a little bit better, it was just a little bit better. Because this version is just fucking solid as it is. And in fact, this is the version that ends up being played live at the more recent shows. So this one, I think, resonates better than the later version that was recorded for Light at the End. You also have some really aggressively hard songs on here, such as Boys and Girls, and the closing track on here, Man Without a Mouth, has Dave screaming at the end with these just very super distorted guitars, something that feels like it could have come off the previous two albums, but the production that was on here makes it really slick and still vicious at the same time. There are so many songs on here that I feel like are some of Rustic's best, just period. Gas on Skin, while I think is a bit short of a song, definitely holds well still. Love Underground, which was recorded during the Tommy Boy sessions, that I feel is just an underrated cut. Crash Landing, which is just really awesome. It's definitely more keyboard driven, but it still is hard. I mean, for 16 tracks, and really it's 15 because Beekeeper is more of like is a less than a minute sort of interlude that leads into Man Without a Mouth at the end of the album. This album really should have put Rustic way up there in the alternative rock of the 2000s. Like, this album just had so many great songs on it, and I may just come off as a salty fan, but goddamn right I'm salty. This album's fucking brilliant. For the gold, we have their debut, Long Division, released in 1995. This album I fucking love to death. This is, I would say, probably my favorite album of all time. Period. Favorite albums of all time from 1 to 3. It was for the gold, Rustic Overtones, Long Division. For the silver, System of a Down, self-titled. And at number 3, with the bronze, is The Roots, Phrenology. I love them all so much. This album is just no other album sounds like it. This album came out in the mid-90s when the ska wave was really ramping up. And I understand that this was an independent album, but god fucking damn should this have been huge. The thing is, this album is so energetic and off the wall, and it hops different genres, but while still being a very cohesive listen. You open up with this aggressive drum roll on the song About a Kid, and it's just this hyper energetic ska tune, in which then the last third explodes in distorted guitar and it's like an alternative metal song. You have the song Simple Song, which is one of the most iconic Rustic Overtones songs, in which I wish they played just this version front to back live, but instead they decided to change the verses with Crazy in Love by Beyonce instrumental. I mean, it's fine, but please, Dave, if you're watching this before I die, please play Simple Song in full. Please. The song is fucking amazing. At 6 and I think a half minutes, you have the song that fuses funk rock and ska and alternative rock / alternative metal, kind of grunge sort of sounding. Another notable song on here is the song 20 Years, which is the heaviest thing Rustic has ever recorded still to this day. It's under 3 minutes, and it's just heavy. It's fucking heavy. And it is just brilliant. Funny enough, the song following it, called Fake Face, is just the most straight up ska song they've ever done. But toward the second half of the song, it actually starts picking up in tempo. So it's just this really fast, clean guitar ska song that is, it's kind of almost comical sounding, but it's also just super fun. And then following that up, you have a song like Dig, which is over 7 minutes of just like funk, soul, psychedelic shit that is amazing. After that, you have the song Feel, which is one of my favorite tracks, just on a rhythm. Just rhythm alone is one of my favorite songs of the 90s. I could just go on with the song Pimp and the title track, which would have easily been a fantastic ska rock single, and the last 3 songs, Slowly, Outlaw Biker, and Pop Trash. And even the other 2 songs I didn't mention between Simple Song and 20 Years, in which I don't have it right in front of me, so I apologize for not remembering those songs off the top of my head. Even those ones are great. No other album sounds like this album. From the ska genre, alternative rock genre, funk rock genre, or just in the 90s in general. The production on here is super raw, but yet condensed enough that, you know, it's not like hardcore punk making your ears bleed lo-fi kind of recording. There's definitely a production value to it. It's just a very rough production. The energy on here is just unmatched. I don't know any... I could keep on repeating how I don't know any album that sounds like this, because this fuses this high-intensity alternative rock, arguably even like ska punk sounding fusion, with funk, with soul, with jazz, and even some metal, depending on the song that's on here. Every single song has its own distinct qualities to them, and yet they are placed in such a way that it's cohesive, which is something that I feel that Rooms by the Hour just didn't quite do. It wasn't as a cohesive structure. Long Division just does. And from front to back, the album is well over an hour, and I never get tired of it. Even though I don't like some of the songs that they've gone with in their newer direction on, like, Let's Start Cold Part 1, I don't expect them to come back to Long Division in full, and I would almost feel like that'd be a bad thing if they just, you know, did copy and paste of this album. But this was truly a highlight, I think, for just music in general. If this album got any form of mainstream attention, Rustic would have been one of the biggest bands, I think, in the ska and 90s sort of music movement. Rustic Overtones, I feel in general, just deserve more attention than they have. But if I keep just repeating that point over and over, this video is going to be way too goddamn long. So, in short, this is my favorite album of all time, and I feel that this is the best Rustic Overtones album, period. So that will do it for this episode of Discog Devil. Let me know in the comments section what your favorite albums of Rustic Overtones are, from worst to best. Hit the like, comment, subscribe, YouTube shtick. And also down in the description below, I'm also going to have a playlist on Spotify going over the key 3 tracks from each album in chronological order. And also I'm going to have an extra video going over Viva Nueva, the Arista version versus the Tommy Boy version, which one I thought was stronger than the other, And on an A&R level, if Arista was to be released, was the version that we got, not the Tommy Boy version, what sort of strong points that album would have had. Continue to follow this playlist too. I will also have in the description down below a playlist of this season of Discog Devil and the 4 episodes prior to this. And, stay tuned. I got another 5 artists coming down the pipe. Thank you all for watching. I'm Greg, Gregarious Media. See you in the next episode.
Lost in fucking action.